Awesome. Yeah, and obviously, if your consent to record changes at any point, you can let me know. That is completely fine. Great. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome the first affirmative speaker to begin the debate.
Children require stability when growing up, and everything we can do to help them with that is going to result in more well-adapted adults as we grow up. Romantic and sexual relationships do not form stable relationships due to the intense emotions, and friendships are a much better alternative to provide stability that children need. First of all, why we get more stable relationships. Number two, the benefits of this. And thirdly, the benefits of having the societal benefits around this. All right. Look, firstly, it's important to understand that romantic and sexual relationships are typically much more intense, and this is for multiple reasons. Firstly, because they're typically monogamous, you cannot simply move away from someone slowly and slowly pick up on someone. You have to have a clear end. This ultimately means that they're no matter what happens with them, there will always be some amount of strong emotions at the end of it, which is bad. Which is going to result in conflict, and which is obviously bad for children. Number two is just there is a lot of pressure around romantic relationships, from society, right, and to find the one, and around sexual relationships to be sure that are you doing it the correct way? In contrast to, for example, friendships where they can exist in multiple different forms. Thirdly, just inherent jealousy and stuff around romantic and sexual relationships are much heightened compared to friendships, right? For all of these reasons, romantic relationships are much, much more likely to lead into conflict, into drama that is going to spill over into the private lives, that is going to affect the children, and that is bad, right? They're also much less likely to be long-term, whereas friendships tend to last a lifetime, right? And this ultimately is bad for the stability of children. Okay, let's talk about why. All right. First of all, kids require stability when growing up. This is for a couple of reasons. Firstly, that they're just still learning. It's a lot harder to learn about the world when it's constantly changing and you don't have a home base to go back to, right? That means that they can't tell if this is just how the world is or if this is just their specific situation, which sets them up for maladaptive patterns for later in life. Secondly, it's really important for their sense of security and safety to have somewhere to go back to, because that means they're much more willing to take the sort of risks that are going to let them learn about their environment. So, for example, right, it means that they're more likely to go exploring, even if it means they're going to scrape their knee and get hurt, if they can go home and get a plaster on it and get all better, right? This is far less likely to happen in relationships which have broken down, for example, when the parents have divorced, right? So when you have friendships, you can actually model healthier relationship dynamics, right? Because the parents chose to be in this relationship for the kids, right? They're less they're going to put more effort into focusing on the child's relationship, right? You're far less likely to have a child who save a friendship in comparison to a romantic relationship. Could you start to it, Anna? Right, all of this, and because they chose to be together, they're much more likely to put in this effort to model a healthy relationship dynamic for the children. All right, and also finally, because there is a less intense relationship, there is going to be a less intense breakup. Right, this means that you have because there's less ego and less vulnerability. Right, and you don't need to have the definitive end that you do with monogamy. Right. Finally, on the extended benefits around how this is going to look, right? So it is incredibly likely that the parents' friends are also going to be having kids themselves. And because friends are not hierarchical romantic and sexual relationships, it is the children are more able to approach those other parents in a way that they can't under the status quo. Ultimately, that means that they have more people to talk to, which is good for the children's sense of stability and safety. Because if your parents are arguing, you don't have anyone to turn to. But if your parents have a friend, that is okay, right? And that can work out. And you're much more likely to see them as someone you can talk to because there is a similar level of intensity. All right. It also means that the parents are more likely to have a person to talk to around their romantic and sexual relationships, which is just good for the parents' mental health, which obviously trickles down. Because it is very typical for people to not have close bonds outside of their romantic relationships. This gives them another strong bond, which is beneficial for the child. All right. Finally, children are simply exposed to more people growing up, right? Because at minimum, they're going to have their two parents romantic partners, which is like 4 people compared to the 2 currently. That is ultimately good for their development because they get more perspectives on the way things can be growing up, right? Finally, it just also promotes platonic relationships as meaningful and important over rather than simply romantic ones. And this is good because people need all kinds of relationships. And if they simply focus on like romantic ones, they're likely to neglect parts of their mental health, which is ultimately going to be bad for everyone. At the end of the day, relationships where you have based on less drama, based on where people choose to come together for the specific purpose of this relationship of raising a child, are likely to do it better for children because they're going in with knowing and full consent, because they know, because they're prepared to do everything they're going to do, because you don't have a child to save a friendship. And all of that means that you can actually have a more stable, more secure environment to raise children, which is ultimately what we stand for.
Okay, thanks very much for that speech. And whenever you're ready, I'd like to invite the first negative speaker to begin the negative team's case.
Sorry, Ellie, one sec. Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay, I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. Affirmative wants to say that it takes a village to raise a child well, but a village can't collectively change a child's nappy or comfort a child when it is crying. You require a parent for that. And the point of that saying is that it is good for adults to know other adults so that child can access more, adult role models, mutual success and mutual networks of support, not that the parent should not exist in its entirety. The first thing I'm going to do in this speech is provide one direct response to the other side. Then I'll explain why this is bad for children and why that's a debate winning benefit. Second, why it's a debate losing harm. Then I'll explain why it is bad for people's relationships and explain why that's a debate winning harm. And then finally, I'll explain why it's bad for society writ large and why that's a debate winning harm. On to the first piece of direct response. We would just note, under the status quo, parents can have friends and children can know more adults than just their parents. They can have extended family, they can have uncles and so on. So the benefit of a child having multiple adult role models that they wanted to prop is something that we can support under our side quite happily. I think the panel presumably knows adults in their lives other than their children. But the second kind of broad observation that I would make in response is I would just, and this is kind of an intuition pump for our first point, just think of the fact that there are many moments in a parent's life where they are under immense stress, where their kids are being awful, their partner isn't listening, the dishes are undone, etc. haven't been done, etc. And under those situations, many people would like to leave. In fact, many people often do leave, and we point, in fact, in particular to, like, often men who choose to leave and leave the work of raising children to women. And the problem here, right, for their side is that the places that occurs in the status quo are often quite weak or unstable romantic relationships, which are often about as weak, about as strong as the strongest possible friendship. The implication of the case you just heard was that more parents will leave. There'll be significantly more turbulence in a child's life. As the side affirmative themselves tell you, that is harmful. Why is this bad for children? We're obviously starting here because children are by far the most important actor in the debate. They're extremely vulnerable. They happen to be quite small. And of course, because they're young, the things that happen to them in childhood affect them across the course of their entire lives. They suffer in two ways. The first is, under their side, they lack a source of stability, which is important, right? Because it's important for children to have a stable home environment for kind of two key reasons. One is that they need the environment. They have to feel that the environment is a loving place with people they trust, and it takes time to build that trust. But two, there's a lot of turbulence in that relationship because children are quite egocentric, which is to say they think everything is like their fault, right? When an adult leaves or when an adult spends time with someone else, they are likely to view that as a failure of them because the adult doesn't love them very much because, they have made some kind of mistake because they said the wrong thing. So raising children is obviously hard, as we don't think they would contest, but we would point to the fact that romantic relationships tend to have a far deeper level of intimacy than even the strongest friendships. That's for 4 reasons. One, obviously, because of the heightened intimacy that occurs in a romantic relationship, you just understand the partner better. 2, you're far more likely to be honest and communicate well with that partner than you would with any one of your friends. You just tend to be more open. You tend to discuss things. You tend to have a problem bringing it up more often. 3, you obviously are far more selective in your choice of a romantic partner than you are with a friend, which is to say many romantic relationships operate in a process of carefully over time refining the values until you find someone whose values are near identical to your own, whereas friends often have very different values even if they are quite deep and trusting relationships. And thirdly, also people in romantic relationships also happen to be friends, so we can claim all their benefits but lay it on top with a deeper level of intimacy. Because parenting is hard, as I've already flagged, it's quite likely that people who aren't in a romantic relationship and won't have the depth of trust and intimacy to be required to day after day sacrifice and commit to raise that child as is necessary, they are likely to try and walk away or just spend less time. And this means that under their side, one, parents have a weaker connection, which means the relationship is significantly less stable. The kid is being passed around more often between adults, or, as we suspect is quite likely, someone will enter one of these relationships thinking the idea of having a kid is a good idea, crack at it for a while, realize they have other things in their life, and then want to move on and feel significantly less bad about that because they're not walking out in their life partner as they are at the same time as their kid. But the second thing we point out is these parents are also quite likely to have romantic relationships well, but just with someone who isn't the parent of the kid that they're raising, which is incredibly confusing for children because they see that parent having affection with someone who's not their own parent and they feel confused. They wonder why their parent doesn't want to be around their particular family unit. They wonder why they don't love them, etc. The second way in which this harms children is it harms children through a lack of proper role modeling, which is to say children need to learn good behavior from their parents and they need to understand what it's like to be a person, and they learn that from the most important people in their lives, which is to say their parents. And the important thing to understand about this argument is that parents model proper behavior in romantic relationships, and it's one of the most important things that parents do, which is to say these children will go on to experience sexual feelings for other people, and the only information they'll have what it's like to be in a relationship is either like the cotton candy stuff you see in rom-coms or just like the experiences of sexual attraction, the feelings of sexual attraction they have. They don't, for example, if they're a young boy, see their father treating their mother with respect. They don't see the little loving things that parents do for each other, the quiet moments they share, the importance of proper communication. They see none of those good behaviors role modeled, and as a result, all of their relationships, and given this happens across everyone in society because it's a widespread norm, everyone's romantic relationships get worse, which obviously feeds into the next piece of argumentation. It's like worth pointing out, like children having worse childhoods for everyone is obviously a debate winning harm right away. But here's why this is also bad for relationships in general. One, we'll point to the parenting being harder. It's already quite difficult, but because you're talking about two friends who have less to give to each other because they're, not as close, they're not as intimate, it's obviously going to make parenting significantly more difficult. The second thing, okay, hold on. We've got an internet problem. What? Oh, yeah, no, I'm sorry, Ellie. I'm not sure if there's an internet problem, but you just froze.
I paused my timer. I don't think there's an internet problem. I could hear okay. But yeah.
Okay. Well, how about you just start me from where you were timing?
Yes, so you're on parents being closer to each other and supporting each other. It was roughly 6 minutes and 5 seconds.
Sure. Well, I'll just keep going from there. So the crucial thing to understand here is parenting is much, much harder. Makes the experience of parenting harder. If you're a parent who just have a harder time, that's obviously incredibly important, and you rely on other sources of support and fulfillment. But the second issue here is your romantic relationship is also likely under a tremendous amount of stress because you have less time to share with your romantic partner because you're busy trying to maintain your relationship with another friend, parent, and your child. You also have to, you worry about how to meld the two relationships, how to introduce your child to your new romantic partner. You feel a tremendous amount of guilt when you're with either party, either with your romantic partner or with your child, because you'll feel that you're neglecting either one. We think under that side, what's likely to happen is people either have to choose between being a parent and having no romantic relationships, which is obviously very unfulfilling, or choosing a romantic relationship and having no friends, or attempting to do both, probably failing and becoming very unhappy. Finally, we think that friendships get worse because it places a burden on friendship. Think about their analysis on how there's a burden on romantic relationships, and think about how friendships become much harder because everyone's always worried about whether it might turn into a child-rearing one, because you often have to pick, if you're picking between friends, that can create tension within the friend network. Because friends are a tremendous source of support, and you probably have fewer friends because there's a high commitment cost of having friendships. All of these arguments then interrelate. Parenting is harder, romantic relationships is harder, friendships are harder, and no one has the support they need to manage that properly, which is why all of these relationships are far, far worse. Finally, the third and final argument is about why this is bad for society. Given that we've shown it's much harder to have children, it's quite costly, it's quite likely that one, less families will form because people see it as an explicit and much higher commitment, and two, people will form smaller families because it's quite likely that the two friends who started one family won't go on to have a second kid and will likely break apart. That means that you just get one, far fewer children being born, which is terrible if you consider the dependency ratio and the impact that has on, for example, trying to run a society with a gradually shrinking workplace. But two, it also worsens the gender pay gap because it is overwhelmingly likely that it is women who will be the friend in the parenting relationship who sticks with the child, who isn't the one who has to sacrifice work. This dynamic already exists in the status quo, but is made far, far worse under the side affirmative side. This is terrible for people, right? It is terrible for them as children. It is terrible for them as parents. It is terrible for them as friends. It is terrible for them as romantic partners. It is terrible for society as a whole and its structure. I could not be prouder to stand against it.
Okay, thanks very much for that speech. And now I'd like to welcome the second affirmative speaker to continue the affirmative team's case.
Hi guys, sorry, just sorting myself out. Just give me 1 second. Okay. Cool. Just checking everybody can hear me clearly. Yeah, fantastic. Cool. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Sweet. So the negating side today is kind of making this assumption that, like, under our model, kids are like raised parentless, have no stable family, and like really are just like truly loved, and this is the best like situation for a kid to be in. All the talking points kind of seem like the things like, oh, kids can't understand why their parents are like dating somebody of the same gender or something weird like that. Like, we think that this isn't that hard for kids to understand, and I'm going to run you through all the benefits that we get on our side, and I'm going to break this down into a couple of categories. Firstly, I'm just going to break down Neg's argument. Firstly, like why kids suffer, and then like discussing how parents suffer. And I'm also going to go on to a little split about how we actually get a really, really beneficial reformed family model under our side of the house. So cool. And talking about this kind of stuff about children's stuff. So what we heard from the negating team is that these kids need 2 stable adults. We think that they've really misinterpreted our model here and saying that like the kids will just be raised by like a miscellaneous village of people. We think that they were still going to have 2 stable adults. Like, it looks like 2 friends who've had like a really strong bond over the years, deciding that they both want children, or like, and don't have a romantic partner, or instead want to do it with their platonic partner, which we prefer, right? We think that it's going to look like that, them choosing to have a child and building their life around that because they have a really strong connection, right? This isn't going to be be some man that I meet on the side of the street and be like, hey, do you want to have a kid with me, and just like raise it together. We think that's absolutely not what's going to happen under our model. And like these are going to be people with the same values as the person who is like carrying the child, like, or whatever. There can be 2 or more like stable parents in a relationship, like even 3. This can look like living like in one house, so like they do have a lot of like connection, and even if it doesn't, we think this would probably just operate in the same way that like we have like divorced parents in current society. They can still raise very good kids who like perfectly understand that there are 2 separate entities going on in their lives. But on the right side of the house, what we avoid is all of the trauma of the child having to experience the kid's divorce, like the parents' divorce, and all the hatred they have towards each other, right? So that's what it's actually going to look like. We've had this accusation of like, oh, the kid won't be able to understand proper communication. I think that that's like just a very like odd generalization of all friendships. Like, have you not had a proper friend in which you communicate with them about your feelings? Also, if you are like a strong and have a bond and decided to raise a child, proper communication is key. Like, they're going to like experience their friends, like their parents and their parents' friends getting together in the kitchen and talking about like, oh, okay, so what school do you want to go to for high school, and having that conversation. Like, these aren't isolated events that only happen in romantic relationships. The entire prospect of parenting requires good communication, and as we've set up through our model, it's not going to be random people who don't understand each other. There will be good communication present in the relationship. We also we think of this idea of like kids, like parents don't know how to have good relationships, like good friendship relationships, because they haven't had proper relationships. We think that this can still exist on our side of the model. Parents can still have like their like romantic partners, and I'll address why they can do that like later on. But because of that, they're still going to have 2 different avenues like in their life. They will have proper communication, and like kids will be able to see them interact like, I don't know, romantically with a partner. But even if that but even if that isn't the case, we don't think that like kids in high school are basing their like first high school girlfriend off the way that their parents interact with each other and their parents' sex life. We think that's a bit weird. Like, the way that you interact is mostly like defined by your peers and the people around you. So we think that probably just kind of falls out of the point there. So we've also had this idea about like friends will leave their kid because it's, I don't know, like not biologically theirs, so they feel less guilty. I think that like that kind of reasoning can just be broken down with like, you still have gay couples that adopt, and even though it's not biologically their child, it's still their child, right? Like they still very much care for it. They've chosen to enter this relationship in which they have a child, and they center their life around that. As North's already thoroughly explained to you, these kind of relationships are so much more beneficial for the child, because the child is not used as like a pawn. It's not an accident. Children are valued, and relationships are formed around the want for this child, right? So it's like you eliminate so much potential trauma from a child's life by having a friend there. So on this kind of point about like friends will just leave, firstly, we think that if you're a parent, you simply care about your child. Like, obviously there are like deadbeat parents, but we think this is far less likely to occur if this is like a conscious decision made by friends to like have a child. It's not some kind of thing like made to try and save a family, right? We think that they probably care about the kid. It's also probably best if the parent leaves in the situation. Like, if the parent did leave, it's better under our side of the house, because as we've already explained to you, we have this whole situation where relationships need a definitive end because of like societal monogamy. You cannot just like casually start seeing someone else and drift out of their life. There has to be a definitive end to it. The child sees it, experiences it, and watches their whole world shatter. If those kind of like if there isn't a committed like forever ship from the start of the relationship, then we think that child like it's probably better for them if one parent has to leave, right? Because they just see somebody phases out, somebody else can maybe phase in without that like absolute trauma that often happens in relationships, because you have like massive jealousy, or somebody's cheating, or like your values don't align anymore. You can't have that gentle separation like you can in friendships, right? So I think that is why it is less bad. Also, you just have an extended parenting network, like we've explained, and I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit later. And just lastly, on this kind of thing about like parents suffering, like to choose between kids, and there will be like less families in society. Like we've said, like we think that because there's going to be an extended parenting network, like I'm going to explain in a little bit, you're going to have more options for people who are going to look after your kid. There will still be a lot of interactions, but it doesn't mean that you have to like devote your whole life to one like partner and one thing that's going on in your life. You can still see your kid, and then in your spare time, when like your friend who's also the parent of the kid is looking after them or has some free time, you can go and you can like go on dates and things. Like we really don't think these things are mutually exclusive. It's the same, like I've said, it's the same way that like divorced parents can still raise healthy kids, and like you know, all of that kind of thing, and kids aren't used as a pawn in relationships. So onto this kind of brief idea about how we get a really good reformed family unit, right? So like, we think that if you have a wider family, say you have like multiple parents, like 2, maybe 3, like, and these are based in friendship, which already have really good values, and then you're going to get romantic partners from those other people, right? So what it actually looks like is that a kid has probably about like 5, 6 stable adults in their life, right? And even if those adults do break up, the trauma on that child is really not that big because their livelihood doesn't depend on it, right? Like the fact their parents are splitting up in that way. Secondly, it means that like we don't choose our family. So like in the same way that you have an uncle, your parents might not want you to interact with that uncle because he's a little bit weird and like super conservative, right? What you can do in this reformed family unit is bring in other people who are on the same status level as family, right? You can like create really close relationships with the people who are around you, who have really good values and things you want to teach your kids from, in the same way that you can't with like a randomly assigned aunt or uncle you've just inherited from one side of a family that you think is really problematic. We think that is a really beneficial thing for parents to have under our model, and we think it's specifically beneficial to children to have a lot of really good, morally valued, trusted adults that raise the child in a way that you can't under the status quo. We also think there's just general benefit because friendships become more valued and like pursued more deeply in society overall, which we think is really good. As we've already said, it sets a really good precedent that like friendships can be important. Relationships are not the be all and end all of society, and are not like the most necessary thing to raise a functional society, raise functional children, all of that kind of thing. And like, I genuinely, if we get less family units, that's probably a better thing. We're overpopulated anyway, right? Like, I don't think it's a absolute net harm for society if this happens. And we've already proven to you all of the benefits that it gives a child when they have a more supportive family unit. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Thanks very much for that speech. And now I'd like to welcome the second negative speaker to continue the negative team space.
Hello. Oh, hello. Am I audible? Okay. What is it that makes a good relationship? Is it the fact that it has intense emotions? Is it like the arbitrary delineation between whether it's romantic or whether it's a friend? Or is it the amount of investment, time, and energy you spend on it? Is it how willing you are to grow and learn in that relationship? Is it the amount of things that you're willing to sacrifice in that relationship because it is filling your cup in other ways? Whether that be sexual, whether that be intimacy, or whether that be friendship that you get in a romantic relationship as well. What is it that builds the bonds that are strong enough that we can feel comfortable bringing another life into this world and helping them to grow up in the way that we can shelter them from the most pain possible? This affirmative team does not understand what it takes to create one of these relationships. They rely on a series of assertions that friendships are immune to things like heartbreak, that friendships are immune to things like breaking up, that friendships are immune to things like cheating. None of these are true. Humans are afraid of being rejected. Humans are incredibly busy working 8 hours a day, sleeping 8 hours a day, busy cleaning their houses, and they've got like 3 left for relationship building. And this team wants to divide that even further in half, leave them exhausted, unsatisfied, and bitter, and unable to spend the majority of their life with all of the people that they love at once because their lover and their child are not even in the same household. This is a miserable world, and thank God it will die out from a lack of population replacement placement because it doesn't sound like a place I want to be. Starting with a few questions in setup. This team doesn't even conceptualize how their world would look. We finally get at that last speaker that perhaps this is going to be like a big Brady Bunch style of family, except like all the kids are the parents somehow, or instead of like having a bunch of kids, what's going to happen is instead of you have two secure parents who become more and more expert at being kids, at having kids, the more that they have, rather you have one kid with a bunch of amateur parents get chopped and changed and added around that don't have expertise, that don't have any incentive to stick around and learn because there is a severe norm in this world that it's okay to drift in and to drift out, that you feel like you don't have responsibility to this child or to learn about their period or to learn about their mental health problems because, the woman in the group can learn about that for them and I can just dip when she turns 14 and I don't understand her hormones anymore and I don't want to fucking deal with her. That sounds like a terrible environment. What's going to happen is children feel like they're in a chaotic world that is out of control, and I will be the first speaker in this debate to explain how that literally changes the neurons in their brain that breaks their ability to ever feel love or feel safe again for the rest of the 80 or 90 years of their life. Starting on then, the idea of what holds relationships together. Firstly, the relationship is a give and take. Whether it's a friendship or a romantic one, you enter a relationship because it provides something to you that you need, and it means that it's worth giving some stuff back in order to get that. So in a romantic relationship, it provides quite a lot, meaning that what you are willing to give in return is larger. What does it provide you? Firstly, it provides you with intimacy. These relationships, by definition, in their world of co-parenting, cannot be intimate. So people who feel like they need to be seen and understood have to seek intimacy somewhere else, not with the co-parent of their child. The second thing they provide you is with desire, both feeling desire for somebody else and feeling desired in and of yourself, which is biologically encoded into you. And that literally, I don't know about you guys, my brain spends a lot of the day thinking about desire. I'm just going to out myself there. Why do we wear makeup? Why do we try to be fit? Why do we try to be hot? Why do we try to be successful? We want to be wanted. We want to belong. It's at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's very important. The next thing that we want is physical things like sex. That is something that you will still seek in both worlds. Thirdly, you want belonging. And fifthly, and fourthly, you want friendship, right? So a romantic relationship can double up on providing friendship, conversation, someone to grab coffee with, and it can provide this intimacy and all of these other needs, right? So it means that in a relationship like that, you are willing to do more to try and save it. On the other hand, they say friendships can't be toxic and that they're going to be fine because they're not as intense. However, that's not true. Friends can be toxic and they're actually far more likely to because of what I just explained to you. Because a friend is not as important to you in terms of fulfilling your needs, you don't fix it, you don't learn, and you don't grow, which means that it becomes worse in two ways. If you are not willing to fix a relationship because it isn't providing enough to you and you're getting half of your intimacy needs and belonging needs from somebody else anyway, right? You don't feel the impetus to sit down and have hard conversations. You don't ever do things like pay for therapy together to learn behaviors about how to be better. And also, you probably were selected together by more arbitrary things than a romantic relationship in the first place, right? Because when you become friends with someone, as this team says, it's usually just based on exposure time and the amount of hours that you have spent together. It's not necessarily based on whether you have the same interests now or whether you've grown into the kind of person that gets along. You probably met them in high school. You might have changed a lot since high school. That can be things that lead to a lot of argument. At the end of this then, friendships can have jealousy, friendships can have cheating. I know that I get upset when my girlfriend goes shopping with somebody without telling me and I feel heartbroken and I feel rejected, almost more so than I do when my boyfriend ditches me, right? So this means that I'm going to feel those emotions and that the added pressure of being in a parenting relationship with this person will mean that blow-ups do happen, will mean that all of the breakup harms I told you about do happen. However, they happen far more often because people don't spend as much time fixing them, and that was deplorable in this debate. But why is this bad for children? The first thing to say here is that children learn their attachment style based on the relationships that they observe in the first couple of years of their life as their brain is literally developing. You can have a couple of attachment style. You could have secure attachment, disorganized attachment, and chaotic attachment. All of this is based on how safe you feel in the relationships around you. You can put a child and observe its reaction when its parent comes back to collect it in the room in a scientific study, and based on whether they run to the parent or run away from it or act crazy, you can figure out what kind of attachment style it has. And what scientists have found is that you are likely to replicate that in all of your future relationships because it becomes a default setting in your brain. The world that they tell you about an affirmative is one in which almost everybody is going to end up with a chaotic attachment style because it comes from a lack of understanding, and children don't have enough intelligence to understand these complex nets of like adults that are somehow responsible for them some of the time in some situations. It's too much for the child to understand. So they are constantly trying to predict who is there for them and failing and feeling like it's their fault that they got it wrong. Somehow now Johnny doesn't love me as much as he did yesterday, and I'm back with Cynthia and her pal Bessie. And what am I doing with these two? I miss Johnny. Like that, that was the parent friend that I liked the most. So we think that we would get more secure attachment styles under romantic relationships because we think it would make it easier for the child to bond, because those relationships are more stable, and because it means that the child is not going to be subjected to things like feeling inherently rejected by one of its biological parents, in that one didn't choose to be a part of the co-parenting friendship that ended up owning this child, and like their dad's off in a house with somebody else. But additionally, in this world of friendships and, you know, co-parenting, parents' time is split in half. This is bad for children because it means that they are less likely to feel safe and secure, like their family is the most important priority to their parent. What do I mean like this? Well, you can, like, in this world, enjoy the benefits of having your dad's best friend as like a sick soccer coach or whatever, but you never worry that your dad's best friend is more important to him than your family is, because you get the benefit of being the child and the lover in the same family unit. So you are very secure in feeling like you are the most important thing in your father's life. You don't ever get that on their side of the house. So the child has to constantly calculate this and feel rejected. At the end of this debate, it's worse for parents. It makes parenting harder to enter into, makes those relationships harder because you get less time to spend on them. You can't read books about being a good parent because you're too busy dating when you aren't looking after your child. You can't get therapy to fix your trauma, to pass less of it on to your children. At the end of the day, it's worse for society. And thank God it's going to die from population collapse when nobody wants to have kids in this terrible, terrible world.
Well, thanks very much for that speech. And whenever you're ready, I'd like to invite the third affirmative speaker to conclude the substantive portion of the affirmative team's case.
So I'm just preparing the timer. Starting speech in 3, 2, 1. The negating team has tried to claim that none of the benefits that are in friendships are exclusive to romantic relationships, but that all of these benefits that romantic relationships get include the ones that are in friendships. That is not at all true, and we get much more intense and better benefits from these friendships than from romantic relationships. So I want to ask two questions in this debate. Firstly, how is stability impacted by this? Right, stability is important for the child. Therefore, the people who win the stability point will probably win this debate. The second point is how much attention these kids get, and overall how good their life is because of it. Okay, cool. So firstly, how is stability impacted? When people enter a friendship and find that, over many years, they get closer and closer together and eventually decide to take on the responsibility of the child, they are much better off than a romantic relationship. And that's because of this comparative. So firstly, the main reason this is the case is because of romance and sex. We were told that romance and sex and intimacy is an important benefit to romantic relationships, and we absolutely agree. But we see this as actually the thing that takes down romantic relationships, because if romantic relationships and their success and their beginning is based on sex and intimacy and these romantic aspects that friendships don't have, then those are aspects of the relationship that make it functional that don't actually help the child, right? The child is not involved in those kinds of relationships, and in those kinds of parts of the relationship. So the intimacy part and the compatibility in terms of sex part, right? So what that means is that a significant portion of why people end up in romantic relationships in the first place is completely irrelevant to the suitability for them to have a child, right, and raise that child together in a loving and warm environment where they stay together and are stable, right? Because for every romantic relationship that is intimate and has like an incredible sex life, there is a part of that relationship that is based on jealousy and worry that person could go somewhere else and find that kind of connection somewhere else, right? Whereas with a friendship, for every part that is, you know, incredibly rewarding in terms of the things you do together, or the places you go, or the things that you experience, there is a desire to do that with someone else, if you like, to bring someone else into the family unit so that you can do a similar thing with them. Those sorts of skills, or sorry, those sorts of characteristics of a relationship are much more transferable to actually raising a child really well. Why is that the case? Well, because you do those sorts of things with your child, right? Everything that's in a friendship you can bring a child along to, whereas half the things that are part of a romantic relationship, they're completely exclusive of the child, right? You cannot do those things with them, right? And so what that means is that the child is much more welcomed into the relationship, and that it's a better, the fact that these two people are together in terms of the friendship is a much better marker of being able to raise a child better, right? Because if two people have come together in a romantic relationship, part of the reason they're together is on the basis of things that are completely irrelevant, which means when it comes time to have a child, they are objectively worse than two people who have only come together because they are really good together at doing the things that are really transferable to raising a child. And that is the material that we brought you at first that has not been responded to. Okay. The other thing is that we heard this characterization that you know, we put on makeup, or we act all lovey-dovey type people in our world to create these romantic relationships because they provide unique benefits, right? And I absolutely agree. But what was also the case, especially with, you know, 21st century society, with Tinder and all that, you have people wanting transient intimate relationships, right? And increasingly we see people cheating on each other. We see relationships where jealousy is a fundamental part of them, right? Very flawed, because it means people fight, and people make up for the fight by having sex, which rewards everyone except for the child in the relationship, right? They can't get any benefit out of that, and they only get harms from that type of relationship. So it's actually very preferable to have a world where people are engaged in much more transient intimate relationships, where they can kind of engage in someone for a day or even a year, right? And then kind of leave and not feel too heartbroken, but also feel like they got some sort of value out of that relationship. And what that means is that there's a lot more stability for a child, because while their parent is, you know, for some part of their life going off and meeting someone new and introducing them to the child gets to know that person for a bit, that breaks off, but the child still has this stable life where they have two or more parents who are willing to hear their problems, who are willing to you know, listen to them when they want to cry, who are willing to go and hang out with them when they want to do that, right? And so we see overwhelmingly friendships are much more long-term, right? Like in the real world, let's do just this basic sense check here. Like if you are in a romantic relationship, that is much more likely to end in a really, really close long-term friendship, right? One that you've maybe had since high school or something like that. That's much more likely to last until you're 80 years old. Whereas if you're in a romantic relationship that's 3 years deep, that probably isn't necessarily going to last right until marriage, or after marriage until your old age, right? Those sorts of relationships are much more volatile because there's less independence, because there's all these jealousy mechanisms, right, that we brought you at first that weren't responded to, like sex and attraction forming that basis of the relationship makes it less stable, because you're going to seek that unique thing somewhere else, or you're going to get bored of that particular thing. Friendships inherently are much more independent, right? And that leads me on to my second point, which is that the amount of attention that these kids get is much higher when it's based on friendships, because if they have two or more parents, right? Firstly, just having more co-parents means that you get more attention more of the time. But secondly, if you have more independent co-parents who are friends, they come together for social events, but for the most part, they also do their own thing. They have other friends, they have potentially their romantic relationships, which maybe you are involved in, maybe like you get to see, maybe you don't get to see. But importantly, but those two things mean that no matter what, there's a parent around who can hang out with you, right? Who you can build trust with, who you can enjoy the company of. And also, whenever there is a fight between you and a parent, or you and or between two parents, right? There's always a parent to go to who isn't involved in that argument, or maybe who's mediating that argument and actually making the situation better and making your home life better. Because that's part of the stability argument, right? Is the fact that you don't end up with a stable home life, even if your parents stay together, if they're fighting all the time, right? If we have this kind of mediator that we brought up at first, if we have this relationship that's built upon multiple different people, then it's a lot more stable. So back to my main point about how much attention these kids get. They obviously get much more attention that's better for them, right? Their attachment is going to be a lot better, right? We were getting that psychology lesson at the end. I think overall scientists say spending more time with your parent is good, right? If both parents are at work or both are fighting or doing their own romantic thing, that isn't good for you. You should have multiple options available. And we were told that maybe we could go see an uncle, but they don't necessarily live at home, right? Our unique advantage is that we can get more people in the family unit, as we brought you at second, right? That you can have more of these people who aren't necessarily just genetically related to you, but also fit into your overall value system, right? That's much more powerful to you, and that's much better to the child overall than someone who doesn't align with the parents' values at all, who comes over occasionally maybe to babysit. You get that much more like deep relationship with that kind of person. You know, we heard the psychology lesson towards the end of the second speaker's speech. I think scientists have shown that divorce is bad. I think scientists have shown that, you know, children need a wide support network, and that's why for when we win the how much attention children get and the stability point, we win this debate.
Okay, thanks very much for that speech. Sorry for forgetting the 8-minute mark. It's actually surprising I haven't done that yet. And now I'd like to welcome the negative speaker to conclude the substantive portion of this debate.
Cool. Can everyone hear me?
You're a bit echoey, but I can audible.
I want to start this speech by just examining if it is likely that parents would choose to have kids in this world, because that is the fastest way to demonstrate that it is not a preferable world. It is clearly a world that people do not value, they do not want to reproduce in it, and it is unlikely to last particularly long. We give you a series of reasons down the bench as to why this is likely. The first one is just to demonstrate that parenting itself is significantly harder. That is for the reason that your relationships as a parent are far weaker. Notably, side affirmative concedes this at first affirmative when they tell you that intimate relationships are far stronger and far more intense than relationships that are based on friendship. We provide a series of additional reasons, such as romantic relationships often begin as friendships, but develop additional forms of attachment between people, and the fact that you're likely to share intimacy, which brings you closer together, and the fact that you particularly select for things like values when you choose to have kids with someone, all which makes that relationship significantly stronger, which makes it much easier to weather the very difficult challenges of parenting. When you feel stressed, when you're low on sleep, when you've run out of diapers, that is far more likely to be things that you can weather together with an intimate partner than you could with a friend. But additionally, and this is where we really build up the margin on this argument, we demonstrate that the range of other factors in your life make it so much harder to be a parent. Because often the things that allow you to get through that are the fact that you have support networks that can assist you, and the fact that you have like a romantic partner who is by your side all the time going through the journey with you, the fact that your friends come around and help out. But we explain those things are far less likely on their side. Because notably, we explain that romance is significantly harder. Because when you're a parent, the vast majority of your time and money are probably spent taking care of your kid. It's far harder to establish those kinds of romantic relationships or to nurture them if you're already in them, which means that it's significantly less likely you'd be able to do so on their side. And even to the extent that you could, it's also unclear how those interactions would work. You'd probably be very tired all the time. It's unclear where you would meet these partners, who would take care of the kid while you did it, etc., which means it's very likely that these people go through this alone. Additionally, we explain that friendship is significantly harder in this world. world, for the reason that friendship now takes on a whole set of additional implications above the status quo. Because you aren't just friends with everyone. Every friendship is just kind of a testing ground to see if someone is good enough to raise kids with later, which puts a whole bunch of pressure on friendships, which means that you kind of sort through friendships in a way that you don't otherwise, and you feel a bit uneasy about the way that you form those friendships. And because when you eventually do pick someone to raise children with, all your other friends feel affronted as a result. They wonder why they weren't good enough. They start to sideline you as a result. It means it's far difficult to maintain a large group of friendship networks that are often exist on our side, but would not on their side, which means that it's not just harder being a parent on their world, also all the support networks that exist to make those things happen don't exist, which is why we suggest it would be very likely that anyone would actually end up having children on that side. And that was bad for a series of reasons. We explained to you, for example, it would rapidly increase the dependency ratio. It would mean that you probably wouldn't have enough kids to support all the older people. It would mean that welfare systems would collapse. It would mean things like pensions wouldn't be able to exist. It would immediately and very significantly destroy the quality of life of most of the people who lived in those countries. And their only response is just, well, oh, the world's probably overpopulated, a premise that is not analyzed at any point in the debate, and notably one that is like just empirically incorrect. We'd note that technological efficiency means that we can obviously support very large populations. It's expected the population will quite safely continue to rise for a long time. Considering that their society probably crashed and burned within a couple of generations at the worst, that is the fastest reason you should believe that we win the debate. We obviously give you additional material on this issue about why this is likely to be particularly bad for things like social norms and society in general. When we talk about how this is likely to significantly disrupt the gender balance of society, for example, when men are more likely to drop out of the relationship because the relationship is weaker and there's less pressure to leave when you would otherwise have in an intimate relationship, when you have things like legal structures built around requiring you to stay, and you have things like the intimate relationship that provides more incentive to stay, and things like social pressure that would no longer exist in this world. We explain that women are far more likely to be dumped with the responsibility of child rearing, which is already a problem in status quo, but is obviously significantly more likely to worsen. And we explain things like, because friendships often are same-gendered, you run into a difficulty where same-sex relationships, which are obviously viable in both sides, result in a problem on their side where you often have no role models that are available to children of the opposite gender, which might be useful, or significantly less than our side when you're more likely to have, you know, even if you're in a same-sex relationship, a number of other family members and friends that would be able to assist in those instances. But secondly, though, on the issue of what is better or worse for children, we also come ahead. We explain to you for a series of reasons on our side, relationships are likely to be more stable and provide better role models, which means that they're likely to allow for kids to develop better, keeping in mind that kids are incredibly vulnerable and egocentric and need those kinds of things. They give us a couple of responses to this argument. The first thing they suggest is just that, well, you don't really need your parents to be role models for you, because obviously you just have peers and you can just look at what your peers are doing. We would ask the question, where are your peers learning from? If they're the same age as you, presumably they would also need a source of inspiration. And if the suggestion is that you should go to the schoolyard for advice on how to form relationships or engage in sexual behavior, we would suggest that that might be unwise in their instance. And we suggest it, in fact, is very likely that you do look to your parents to see how they shape relationships. Like, maybe you don't consciously go like, oh, you should go see what mom and dad do to work out how a relationship works, but obviously it has normative impact in shaping the kinds of expectations you have around how people are treated in relationships, like whether you seek consent and all of those things, which we suggest are very important because the stakes of relationships in teenage years are incredibly high. The risk of abuse, the risk of things like sexual assault are incredibly high, and having that kind of expectation around how you're treated and feeling that you're able to stand up for yourself is obviously of incredible importance, and they avoid that. Secondly, they suggest that there's a problem with support structures on our side because they're hierarchical, while on their side they're more flat and therefore you feel better able to access things. We would point out that firstly, it's unclear in what way they think that family is hierarchical. I guess you have to listen to your parents, but that would presumably be true on both sides. It's unclear what additional hierarchy is at play. But secondly, we'd point out your parents obviously have friends on both sides. So if you felt that was a particular concern, you could obviously access the benefits of just talking to your parents' friends on either side. It was unclear why that hierarchy particularly differed. Finally, we get the weird claim at third, which is just that, well, being a friend is closer to being a parent than being a, like, in an intimate relationship is to being a parent. We would suggest that this is very unlikely for a number of reasons. First and most obvious is we just suggest that being in an intimate relationship also contains a friendship. So to the extent that any of the skills you develop via being in a friendship are applicable to being a parent, there would also be skills that you'd be able to gain via being in an intimate relationship. But additionally, we'd say there are a number of very important skills that intimate relationships teach you that are unlikely to be gained via friendships. For example, you're far more likely likely to need conflict resolution skills developed in a relationship where you tend to spend significantly more amounts of time together and often cohabitate than you would in a friendship where you can obviously just take time apart from each other. Secondly, we'd say that friends often like each other a lot and may say they love each other, but it's obviously a different type of love that is experienced within intimate relationships, but which is often very applicable to the family context. Thirdly, we'd say that the running of a household when you cohabitate is probably a very useful skill to prepare you for having a kid, while being friends is probably unlikely to be so. So for all of those reasons, we'd suggest that we probably get ahead on that metric. Finally, and this is really the big push that they make repeatedly, is just to suggest that divorce is far more likely on our side and that divorce is particularly devastating. A number of responses to this. The first thing we'd suggest is that the premise of this argument is just that on our side, most children are had as a result of parents not wanting, or like intimate relationships about to collapse, where the parents are like, oh, we'll just have a kid, that'll save it. We would suggest that is a relatively rare characterization and not one that is true, but additionally, a number of other responses. Firstly, we would say every time one of the parents' romantic partners leaves on their side, that is also likely to be perceived as a kid as a devastating event, because someone who they saw as a key part of their life is now no longer around, and because they're egocentric, they're likely to blame themselves. Secondly, we'd suggest divorce is still likely on their side, because people can change on their side as well. People can decide they don't like parenting on their side as well. And finally, we'd suggest that as older people who tend to have kids, by the time you have kids, you've probably self-selected for someone that you're particularly stable with and unlikely to leave, but that friendships do break all the time. The impact of this was that clearly all our material still stood on why this was worse for kids. We won the debate for a second time. Proud to negate.
Okay, thanks very much for that speech. And now I'd like to welcome the negative reply speaker to conclude the neg bench. Just checking if you know you're on mute.
Sorry, my bad. I'll just do it. I'll say that again.
Okay.
Cool. Sorry. Side affirmative speak longingly of children raised by a community of happy, uncommitted adults, and they speak darkly of monogamy's collapse, where monogamy fails, and the trauma that divorce inflicts upon children. Let's first examine how likely is that community of happy adults to form. Then we'll discuss whether divorce is quite as bad as they say or quite as prominent as they say. Finally, we'll then compare that to the wealth of material here from side negative, and then hopefully a result should be clear. Firstly, how likely is it that this community would indeed form? The core premise of this argument is a claim that is repeated by side affirmative multiple times across that case, which is that friendships are far more durable than that of romantic relationships. I guess I'd first make the observation that just kind of amusingly, this is sort of like a young person's version of romantic relationships. And I don't mean to cast aspersions on the age of the other side, but to the average 21-year-old, yes, the average friendship probably lasts longer than the average relationship. That is not true when people are of the childbearing age of 40. But the deeper claim they make here is that sexual attraction is unrelated to parenting, which is to say that, people form kind of romantic connections based on how much they enjoy having sex with one another, I suppose, and that is unconnected to the process of raising children, and is precisely why monogamy is a poor kind of basis, or romantic relationships are a poor basis to raising a child. The response from negative that deals with this incredibly cleanly is just to point out repeatedly at each speaker, and especially at second, that sexual intimacy is an indicator of precisely that, intimacy. It is an indicator indicator of trust. And raising a child and being able to be intimate with one another are, of course, deeply related and core processes that are linked and are not notably present in important friendships. The mistake the other side makes is assuming that sex is the whole story. Sex is, of course, just a symptom of the deeper thing, which is a deep relationship and a connection of trust, which brings people together and makes them able to bear the kind of various sort of slings and arrows of, I guess, like marital misfortune. The second claim that they make is that divorce is the key trauma that we need to solve here. There are a set of responses here from side negative that again deal with this community, that deal with this response quite well. The first response is just to point out, as side negative as a third, that this is a small subset of relationships. It's not true that all monogamous relationships end in divorce. Secondly, they point out that the reason divorce is upsetting, which is to say the collapse of stability, are exactly the reasons why we ought not inflict that on the majority of children in the side affirmative as well, which is to say children are far less to be stable, given that side negative already shown that, you know, these relationships are less likely to be stable because of that exact lack of intimacy. It's far more likely that all the harms they identify with divorce are associated far more under their side. Then, of course, side negative to further work just suggests that even in cases where children are divorced, they're still able to form still able to understand how one family unit exists, one with their mother, one exists with their father. They can be stepchildren and so on. They understand that difference. The final thing, and I guess this is just a note, I guess, in sort of weighing a lot of this material, is a lot of these side acts really nice rhetoric about how cool it would be if everyone lived and cohabited in a sort of like, you know, fluid household where there are multiple people in intersecting roles and children can have multiple tension. Misses one, the material from side negative, how children desire primarily stability, not diversity. Two, that often children just want deep relationships with one or two people instead of a lot of superficial relationships, even if relationships are positive with a variety of people. But also three, I think just run this past the common sense check as to say, do many adults wish to cohabit with 5 other adults and 4 children? It seems relatively unlikely. At this point, the weight of negatives material begins to assert itself. Negatives show that children are deeply unhappy and they become unhappy adults incapable of romantic intimacy because they lack that role modeling. 2, parents communicate and trust less, which means parental relationships fail more. They are less able to form romantic relationships themselves, and of course, they are far more wary of becoming friends. People in general do not get to spend time with the other people they love in their world. Finally, this leads to population collapse, and we have nothing but the glibest possible response from the other team, which asserts it might be a good thing. Choose humanity, choose side negative.
Okay, thanks very much for that speech. And to conclude the debate, I'd like to welcome the affirmative reply speaker.
Look, the Ned case fundamentally misunderstands the connection between parents and children. They seem to assume that if the parents necessarily have a good connection, that will translate to the child. The fundamental push down our side has been that is not necessarily the case. Parents can love each other very much and be in a great relationship and still be bad for the children. Given that, we would prefer for children to only be raised by parents who want children, who specifically set out knowing that they were going to have children, are in this relationship because of the children, and are putting in the work for the children, right? That is why we win this case, all right? Look, firstly, let's talk about the stability of these relationships. So then we're going to be talking about what happens if kids model their relationships. And finally, cleaning up some material around populations and the parents' relationships with other people. All right. Look, firstly, we have told you down the line that the traumatic part of divorce is not your parents living apart or having outside partners. It is when your parents scream at each other and use you as a pawn in your arguments against them. Okay, we have told you that friendships do not dissolve in this way, and particularly these co-parenting relationships, for multiple reasons. Number one is that the co-parents chose to be in this relationship for the child. Even if they dislike each other, they're still in it for the child, right? As we have said, you do not have a child to save your friendship, right? Secondly, friendships are just fundamentally are less intense. That does not mean stronger, as the third speaker misquoted me. They can be just as strong, but they are not as all-consuming as romantic and sexual relationships can be. Thirdly, we have told you that they are less hierarchical. Because, for example, we have told you that romantic relationships are typically monogamous, right? Which means that you have to have a breakup, which often leads to extreme emotions and flare-ups, right? In contrast to platonic relationships, where you can maintain them with multiple people at once, right? We have ultimately, Ultimately, this means that the relationship between the parents and the children is more stable, right? And that is the ultimate stability that matters in this debate. Even if there is discord between the two co-parents or more, that is okay as long as the relationships to the children stay beneficial, which they are far more likely to do so under our side, right? There has been some some ideas presented, right? Like, for example, such as the idea that parents who have an intimate sexual connection are therefore going to have a good relationship and be good parents, right? Like, yes, it can be a symptom of a good relationship, but it is not necessarily. And even if it is, they have a great relationship, as I've said, that does not necessarily translate to a good relationship with the children, right? This is not somehow going to result in the weird gender balance as the third speaker tried to bring up late. Men do want to be parents too. That's just sexist. Also, gay parents exist. Come on, let's be real. All right. There's there's been this idea that like kids are going to struggle to model their relationship, and we've told you like obviously kids don't model their high school relationships off their parents' decade plus romance, right? And even still, even if they do, there's so much that is hopefully not exposed to the kids, right? Because the parents are adults and the kids are children, right? Whereas friendships can in fact be all in public, which means you see a much fuller picture of a picture, right? We've told you that kids are likely to learn about this through the education system, and while not great, they probably will learn about it through the schoolyard as a status quo, right? And that it is often better to observe and learn about relationships from an outside perspective with someone who can guide you, say, for example, a co-parent who's not involved in that romantic relationship, right? And finally, this point around like population control. Look, we've told you that people want to have kids, they just can't because of the economic conditions. And if people genuinely all of this is we're potentially going to get fewer kids because we're going to have less kids to save relationships. These kids who would be abused, mistreated, and neglected. That is a good thing, right? That is going to result in people actually doing this for the kids. Because fundamentally, in a world where all sexual and romantic relationships are becoming more transient, we prefer the stability of friendships. We prefer the stability of people who have chosen this life, who have chosen these kids, who are committed to looking after these kids, not to the partner, because the kids are who matter in this debate.
Okay, thanks very much for that speech. So now what will happen is if I could get both of the teams to leave the room, that would be great, and we will deliberate. Okay, awesome. Hi, everyone. Thanks for a really interesting debate. So what I'll do in this adjudication is I'll tell you the result, and then I'll give some general feedback and explain the call. So firstly, on the result, so the panel unanimously awarded this debate to side negative. So let's get into it. So firstly, in terms of feedback, 3 quick pieces of feedback. So the first piece of feedback I have is I think that this debate at times is a little unclear for the reason that it's not immediately set up and it sort of becomes clearer over the debate, but it's not immediately clear what this world kind of looks like in the sense of how this changes the way that families are arranged. I think there is some lack of clarity across the debate as to whether this is, sort of couples, but they're platonic, or whether you have sort of larger, groups of friend groups raising kids. I think either of those is a fine read of the topic, but it's just not necessarily precisely clear which of those is likely. Similarly, I think there could be more work to explain, how people actually make the choice about who they're going to have kids with in this world. Like, what does that calculus look like? Seems like something that is sort of important in understanding this hypothetical world. The final thing I'd note is I think there was perhaps a bit more scope for both teams to talk about old people. This debate was very 20s pilled, in my opinion. And I do think that, it is kind of interesting, how do grandparents do this? What is it like to be an older person who has raised a child not a you're an empty nester, but platonically. I was very curious about that. That's not to say it particularly damaged the debate, that was not discussed, but I think it's illustrative of perhaps more detail in that characterization being useful. All right, in terms of then explaining the call, I think this essentially is judged firstly in terms of what's better for kids, and then secondly in terms of what's better for parents. So firstly on kids, I think the by far most important kind of clash within this idea is about stability, because both teams agree right from first that stability is particularly important in informing kids' childhoods. We hear a lot of psychology from both teams about why that is the case. I will not go back over it, but suffice it to say, both teams believe stability is very valuable. So that then I think requires a comparison between romantic partnerships and friend partnerships. So on romantic partnerships, affirmative tells us mainly that the instability that exists in the status quo comes from, number one, the fact that romantic relationships they end in divorce, often quite messily and often in a way which is emotionally traumatic. Secondly, even where they do not end, there's an extent to which romantic partnerships contain like jealousy or competition that makes them less stable for kids. There's some degree of emotional harm, due to the intensity of that romantic love and the fact that it's kind of like a factor that is kind of outside of raising kids. So essentially, the claim here is that you should remove those things from the actual child relationship, allow parents' relationships with their children to be unsullied by all of that kind of thing, and do the romantic stuff elsewhere, essentially. Additionally, they observe that many relationships potentially don't really intend to have kids and just have them incidentally, and then cope quite poorly with the fact that they incidentally have kids, which I thought was really interesting. I do think, though, that negative is able to deal with this in three ways. The first thing they do, which is just mitigation, is they say, well, look, lots of relationships are relatively healthy, do not end in divorce, are not acrimonious. Lots of people do not just have kids to save their relationship, or do not have kids unintentionally. And I think, that is only mitigation. Clearly, there are a set of relationships that fall victim to those harms. But I think it does suggest that there's certainly quite a large set of kids in the status quo who do have relatively stable upbringings, and that it is possible within a romantic relationship to avoid some of these pitfalls. The second and more important response that we get from negative, though, is that there are a set of structural reasons why romantic relationships are likely to be particularly good. And that is, I think most persuasively, that these relationships have a level of investment and a level of intimacy, which allows for trust. It incentivizes conflict resolution, and it makes it easier to get through moments of difficulty, for example, like changing nappies and things like that. I think those things go to suggest that, even though relationships can be challenging, there are pretty good reasons why people who decide to have a romantic relationship with each other might have the kind of setup to be able to do that well, and then have kids consequently. The third thing they tell us, though, is just that you have to be comparative, in the sense that if we've established there are a set of people who have relatively stable childhoods at the moment and a set of people who don't, the question is then just should we either obviously fix it in the affirmative world, or is it perhaps a harm to make everyone's lives less stable? So onto the characterizations then about friend partnerships. So here, I think affirmative, I will note, is a little bit assertive. They give us a characterization of friends, which is mainly to say they are less likely to kind of break up. They're, often less intense, but they are sort of longer lasting and straightforwardly supportive. I think that negative is able to problematize that pretty well by saying well, firstly, that's potentially untrue. It does seem like you could have conflict within relationships. But secondly, it's potentially a bad thing in the sense that because of that lack of intensity, where high stakes decisions do come up, friends have less of a capacity to navigate that than a romantic partner would. And then the third claim that negative makes in response to this, which I thought was quite clever, was to say, well, perhaps it is true that friendships are like this in the status quo, but they're likely to change in ways that makes them worse in any case, if you were to introduce children to those relationships. So they tell us that the stress of having children and the kind of complexity that adds to a friend partnership probably means that friend partnerships become more fraught in the affirmatives world. I guess the final thing I would note is that affirmative also tells us that at least the things with friend partnerships are that you opt into them. You pick them on the basis that they would be good to raise a child in. I think that this is quite good and is not really responded to enough by negative, who mainly chooses to pick perhaps more casual friend relationships. But I do think that it's insufficient to explain why all of the complications that negative explains don't still happen in a friend relationship that you opt into. I do still think that does seem vulnerable to the kind of challenges that negative observes. So at the end of this, in terms of stability, it seems like romantic partnerships are perhaps imperfect, but they have a level of intimacy which is broadly a good thing in terms of raising children and navigating that, and that friendship partnerships are probably a bit less stable, once you introduce the difficulty of kids into them. There are a few ancillary harms and benefits that teams talk about, notably whether you like know more people on either side. I don't think that this weighs heavily into the debate just for the reason that it seems very symmetrical. It seems like both teams have a fairly large capacity to introduce other role models, etc., into kids' lives. The final thing I will say though here is I do think that negative is able to claim a little bit of an extra, impact when they tell us about navigating romantic partnerships. I did think it seemed useful to have that specific romantic role modeling effect. So that's what we thought about kids. On parents, affirmative essentially tells us that in the status quo, it is relatively unpleasant to be a parent. Like, you often are quite isolated. You don't necessarily have a support system, which would be as positive as it could be. And so having that friendship is likely to kind of make a parent's life better. Negative responds to this in a few ways, which I think are broadly quite persuasive. The first thing, which I've already kind of explained, is that they discuss how this raises the stakes of those friendships in a way that might be unpleasant or reduce, they become, I guess, sort of less unconditional if they're formed around having a kid. The second thing they say, though, is that potentially these support systems are worse if you don't have the kind of background intimacy in a relationship, which I thought was pretty reasonable. And then the final thing they say is essentially just that it seems quite difficult to both pursue romantic relationships and then also have these kind of friend partnerships where you raise kids. And the convenient thing about romantic partnerships is that you kind of combine both functions. And therefore that parents in this world might just kind of miss out on a degree of romantic relationships because they're sort of too busy or because it's quite difficult to pursue them. So I think that was probably the clearest and best characterized account of how parents would navigate this in the debate. So it did seem like, perhaps you have this extra sense of friendship, but it seems like that exists to an extent in a romantic relationship anyway. And then what changes is the fact that you have to kind of disaggregate or deal with all these different parts of your life simultaneously. So at the end of that, it seems like this probably reduces stability and it increases the burden on parents. A few final things just to note then. One, I think there's a small clash about gender. I don't think that was sufficiently explained by either side to really justify how individual friend partnerships would navigate this, particularly given that the characterization of friend partnerships was, kind of tricky to begin with. And then the second thing is a clash about population. I think that negative probably does win this because they do a little bit more explanation about why having a loss of population would be bad. But I did think it was ultimately a little bit more speculative because it was unclear the extent to which people would stop having kids. I think there are probably reasons why that would happen on either side. So at the end of that, then, basically, I think the most important material is about stability. Both teams agree on that. And I think negative is able to secure that. And then they're able to extend the margin by explaining why this makes parents' lives harder. I hope that's clear. Happy to answer any questions. I have quite a lot of feedback, so also feel free to get that. Probably just message me on Facebook or Discord for feedback. And also feel free to chat to anyone on the panel because, panelists and trainees both have excellent ideas about the debate. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ellie. Thank you so much for the OA and well done, Vic. We would love to wish you guys best of luck for the next round and love to grab that feedback off you on Facebook, please. And panelists, if you have a preferred way other than Facebook, we'd love to know what it is. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for a great debate. Good luck with the rest of your rounds.
Yeah. Thank you. Facebook works. All the best.